There's a relatively new fad when it comes to television series that are out these days that I'm kind of a big fan of, and they all kind of run together, but they're shows like American Pickers or Antiques Roadshows or my personal favorite, Pawn Stars. And all of these shows they run together and they're on different channels and different titles, but they all have the same concept, and it's this. People show up in their house and they go up into their attic, or they go to their parents' attic, or they find an old house and they look in the attic of that place and they find stuff, and they take all of this stuff to experts. And they walk up to the experts because they see something in their junk that they think is more than other people have given it credit for being. And they take them to these experts and let the experts talk about their junk. And sometimes what you find out is this junk that people have had in their attic is junk. But every once in a while, one of these people finds something in their attic and they bring it in and they find out that it's something that's worth all kinds of money. They strike it rich and they realize that for a whole long time they've been living underneath buried treasure. And I don't know about you, but if you're into watching these shows, every once in a while when I watch one of these shows, I get this compelling desire to go up and walk around in the attic, right? Just in case there's something up there that I maybe hadn't seen before. And I want you to imagine with me that maybe you watched one of these shows and we found this old house and walked up in the attic together and we found this painting. And you can barely see it, but let's just say you found this painting and it's back in an attic, hidden away. And we begin to look at it and you realize, and I realize, even through an untrained eye, that this painting is very, very old. And in fact, on closer examination, we realize that it's been hand painted. And you don't know a lot about art and you don't know a lot about history, but you recognize this. See, you can tell that this is old enough and it's hand-painted enough that maybe, just maybe, this thing that we found is a draft. Maybe a first draft by Leonardo da Vinci of a painting that would someday become famous as the Mona Lisa. But there's a problem with the thing that we found in the attic, and it's this: it's covered with mud. It's filthy. It's messy from being in the attic for years, maybe hundreds of years, and it's got a layer of dust and of filth all over it. You and I would realize that maybe there's something to this picture. And yet, in order to uncover the masterpiece, we got to do something about the mess, right? So how would we handle this painting, this masterpiece that we found in one of our attics? Well, what we probably wouldn't do is take the masterpiece outside and take it on with a garden hose, right? I mean, we'd know that something has to be done about the mess, but there would be something just a little bit different about this picture that would cause us to pause before we just took the garden hose to it to clean it off, because we'd understand that we had a risk of messing up the masterpiece. You and I know a whole lot of people that are a whole lot like this painting, don't we? The Bible says really clearly that all of us, just by being human, have inherent human dignity, that we are created as a masterpiece, created in the image of God, and yet for a whole lot of us, either ourselves or people that we know, either by the process of going through life and the circumstances we find ourselves in, or things that we've done to ourselves, we find out that either ourselves or the people that we know, for a whole lot of us, the masterpiece is covered up by a mess. And when we encounter those people, we've got a couple of tendencies as people who follow Jesus. One of them is to look at the messy masterpiece and decide that the mess is too great. It's gone on for too long, it's too far gone, and it obscures the masterpiece to the point that the masterpiece no longer has any value. And so we put it back in the attic and walk downstairs and forget all about what we've seen. Or some of us have a tendency to go after the masterpiece with our religious garden hose, trying as quickly as possible to just spew a bunch of stuff at it in hopes that it'll knock off the mess. Well, as we look this morning at Jesus' encounter with a woman who's a masterpiece, we see something different. And as we take our mess and the mess of the people that we know to the feet of the Master, he gives us some perspective on how he would reveal the masterpiece. And in doing so, he shows us what an encounter with him would look like. He shows us, as people who follow Jesus, how to uncover a masterpiece when it's messy. And in order to see it, I want to introduce you to a woman that may be familiar to you. She's found, and her story is found, in the Bible, in John chapter 4. So if you've got a Bible this morning, turn to John chapter 4. The whole Underdog series, we're going to be looking at underdogs in the book of John and watching as Jesus encounters these people. And what we see is you look in John chapter 4, and actually if you don't have a Bible or don't have one that makes sense in a translation that you can understand, grab one that looks like mine. They're spread all over the auditorium, and you can grab it. We're going to be on page 741 of that one, and in fact, you can take it with you as our gift. We'd love to get more because we'd love for you to have a copy of the scriptures so that you can follow along and look at the rest of the story as Jesus encounters other underdogs that maybe we're not even going to talk about, and how he can encounter an underdog just like you. So what I'm going to do is introduce this lady and introduce a little bit of her story, and then we're going to watch together as the Master goes to work on this masterpiece. And some of you that don't have Bibles that look just like mine have a heading in your Bible right over John chapter 4, don't you? It says something to the effect of Jesus talks with a Samaritan woman, right? Something similar to that. My Bible doesn't say that. And those things, those headings weren't a part of the original writings. They're kind of like the verse numbers. Those are things that we added in later to help us organize the information. But when a person first read this book, they just read the story. And we know that these aren't inspired in some respects because we look at ancient manuscripts. But the other thing is that if this heading, Jesus talks to a Samaritan woman, had been over the original manuscripts, everybody would have dismissed the book and thought that the book was something to be hung with things like National Enquirer in the first century. You know that this story heading, Jesus talks with a Samaritan woman, would show up right alongside the story about the three-headed alien baby and the hidden Kardashian sister that nobody knew existed, right? This is the kind of thing that was made in tabloids. People would never believe that somebody like Jesus would talk to a Samaritan woman. This woman had all kinds of strikes against her that caused her to be an underdog. First, we know she was a Samaritan. Let me give you a little background on Samaritans. About 700 years before this encounter, in 722 BC, the Assyrians invaded the northern kingdom of Israel. And when they invaded the northern kingdom of Israel, they took all of the strong people, all of the people that had talent, all of the people that had promise, all of the people that had a history or means or the family, and they deported them. And they left only the people that were weak. Only the people that didn't have a future. Only the people that didn't have any power. And they imported foreigners. And the foreigners were instructed to intermarry with the weaklings and to compel them to begin to worship the Assyrian gods. So hundreds of years later, when real Jews came back on the scene, these people were still left. But they were seen as half-breeds. They were seen as cast-asides, as leftovers, as religious compromisers. And the real Jews hated the Samaritans. They would have never talked to a Samaritan person. In fact, they avoided even being in the same region as the Samaritans. If a really good, religious, God-believing Jew were to have to travel from the south part of the country to the north part of the country, they would have to travel through Samaria. But they would travel north until they got to the border of Samaritan country, and then they'd hang a sharp left turn and go way out of their way and all the way around so that they could get to their destination, because they believed that Samaritans were perpetually unclean, not to be fellowshipped with, not to be encountered, certainly not to be talked with. Jesus talked to a Samaritan, but not just a Samaritan woman. And in Jesus' day, it was considered politically incorrect for a man to talk to a woman in public of any kind. especially if it was a woman that wasn't your wife, and especially if that woman had a past, a reputation. And as we read on in this story, we find out that that's exactly the case with the woman that Jesus encountered as he traveled through Samaria. In fact, we find out later on the story that this woman had a very, very public reputation. See, she's been married 5 times before. And the man that she's living with now isn't her husband. She wears her messiness in the form of public disgrace, in the form of a public reputation in a really small town, which is a bad combination. You know, we don't know a whole lot about why it is exactly that this woman's been married 5 times, but we could take some educated guesses. And none of them are good. I mean, part of the scenario may have been that all of her 5 husbands had died, in which case this woman living in a small town would have been immediately assumed to be cursed. Either that or to be a really, really bad cook. And she would have been cast aside by society as cursed or even demon-possessed. It may be that all 5 of these men left her for another woman, in which case you can only imagine the interpersonal baggage, feelings of worthlessness and weakness and undesirableness that this woman would live with every single day of her life. It could be that she wasn't able to get pregnant. And in Jesus' day, it was permissible to divorce a woman who couldn't give you children. And so it's possible that she went from husband to husband to husband, every time hoping that maybe this one would be the one. And now she's even given up on the husband part. Whatever the circumstance, whatever the situation, whatever the reason, whatever the history, this is a woman who's messy. She had messiness written all over her, to the point that she shows up at a well at noon, more thirsty than she had any idea. Covered by public disgrace, and you can only imagine that nobody, especially this woman, could see the masterpiece underneath. Before we look at how it is that Jesus interacts with her, I want you to look really carefully at this woman. Because this is not just a story about a woman standing by a hole in the ground. This is a story about a familiar character. Probably somebody that you know really well. In fact, maybe this is a story about the person that stares you down in the mirror every single morning when you wake up. Maybe it's a person that you pass as you walk down the street, a friend of your kid's friend, or a parent of one of your kids' friends. Maybe it's somebody that you know from the office, or a mom that you run into on the tennis court. Maybe it's the waitress at your favorite restaurant. Maybe it's written all over them. Maybe they wear it in the clothes that they choose, or the way that they decorate their body. Or maybe you have to look closely to see it. It's on the inside. A function of past decisions, a background, a reputation, a history. Well, whatever the cause, whatever the mess, the person that you see is thirsty because life left them dry. And Jesus is going to offer to quench that thirst. But before we move forward, what I want to ask you to do is to title this message on your own this morning. We've titled the message, Water for Blank. And right there where we have a blank, I'd like for you to write in some initials, or a name, or to draw a picture that will remind you of the person that Jesus is talking to in this story. Is Jesus talking to you? What he's showing you is what an encounter with the master could look like. Is he having a conversation about a neighbor, a friend, a coworker, a family member? Jesus is showing you how to go about having the conversation that he wants you to have as you move forward in that relationship. Because underneath the mud, underneath the mess, underneath the lifestyle, underneath the dust, Jesus sees a masterpiece. I want you to see this woman's story as he shows us how to uncover a masterpiece. Look at John chapter 4, beginning in verse 3. John chapter 4, beginning in verse 3, John's writing about Jesus, and he says this: He left Judea and went back once more to Galilee. Now, he had to go through Samaria. So he came into a town in Samaria called Sychar. Near the plot of ground Jacob had given to his son Joseph. Jacob's well was there, and Jesus, tired as he was from the journey, sat down by the well. It was about noon. Well, John introduces the story, and the first thing that he tells us is that Jesus had to go through Samaria. And if you've read any of the history and even listened to some of the introduction this morning, you already know that's really not the case. If we're talking purely about geography, Jesus didn't have to go through Samaria. In fact, no devout Jewish man who really feared God would ever walk through Samaria. They would take a left turn and then head north and around Samaria, but they would never, ever go through Samaria. But John's wanting to let us in on something different, something maybe inside of Jesus. See, when Jesus walked through Samaria, everybody would have stared at him. He would have been the outsider. They would have whispered about him, been suspicious of him. Because people who really loved God didn't go through Samaria. But John says he had to. See, this is an intentional move by Jesus. He was compelled, and John later tells us why. It was because of his love for this messy masterpiece. And for the people that she represented, Jesus had to go through Samaria. Jesus shows us the first step in restoring a masterpiece, and it's this if you're taking notes. He moved out. He moved out of his comfort zone. He moved out of the stereotype. He moved out of his comfort level and the comfort level of the people that traveled with him and the comfort level of the people that he went to. He moved out at what was normal and he pursued this woman. He didn't wait for her to come to him. He didn't wait for her to bring something up. He moved out towards her, moved out of what was normally expected of religious people. And because of the journey, he sits down. And this woman shows up, and you can only imagine the thoughts that would have gone through her mind as she approaches the well where she's tried to go alone. And she sees already sitting at the well a Jewish man sitting all by himself. And you can imagine her reaction was first fear. Why is a man there at the well? Why is a Jewish man in our territory, and why is he alone? What does he want with me? What does he want from me? And as this woman who has learned not to trust men walks up, you can imagine the thoughts going through her head. And so Jesus moves out first. Look at verse 7. It says, when a Samaritan woman came to draw water, Jesus said to her, "Will you give me a drink?" And as we read that, it sounds like a totally benign request, but this is way out of the comfort zone of what any normal religious person would do. This is way beyond political correctness of people who wouldn't even walk on the same street as Samaritans because they were afraid that they might accidentally become unclean by osmosis. And yet Jesus looks at this woman. He talks to this woman. But further, he offers to drink after this woman. Jesus sends her a really clear message. And the message is this: I'm not afraid to be close to you. I'm not afraid to be near you. I'm not afraid to look you in the eye. I don't see you as the kind of person to be avoided. I see you as the kind of person who should be pursued. I'm not going to look down on you. I'm not going to belittle you. I'm not going to hurt you. I'm not going to hose you off. In fact, I'm going to let you meet my need. Could I have a drink? See, he models something else as he's moved out of his comfort zone and out of the stereotype and out of the prejudice. And he comes to this woman. He doesn't wait for her to come to him. He leans in to her. He's moved out of the comfort zone, and now he leans into this woman whom everybody else leaned away from. And it totally blows her category. She says in verse 9, I don't know if you've noticed, but you're a Jew, and I'm a Samaritan, and we don't really have a whole lot in common. And in verse 10, Jesus says, ma'am, you have no idea how abnormal this conversation we're having is. Look at what he says in verse 10. Jesus answers her, if you knew the gift of God and who it is that asks you for a drink, you would have asked him, and he would have given you living water. See, in Jesus' day and even in our day, well water comes from a pool that's fed by a spring. The pool is usually fairly stagnant, but the water comes into it through a spring. The spring is the source. And every once in a while, on a day like today, when the rain has come and the spring is really moving, people would look at a spring and they would say of the source, wow, that water is alive. I mean, it's really moving. And Jesus says to this woman, you know what? You've come to the pool, and the pool's not moving. But I, if you're willing, can take you to the source. I can offer you living water. I can do better than just quenching your temporary thirst. I can take you to the place that the pool comes from. And she's confused. She says, you're not getting to the source with my jar and rope. I mean, are you greater than Jacob that dug this well? And historians and archaeologists tell us this well that's still in existence today is one of the deepest in all of the area. She says, you already had to use my jug, and if you're asking to use my rope, unless you've got a rope deeper than this, I'll tell you, I've been here before, and you're not finding the source in this well with this rope. You're going to have to come at it with a lot longer rope than Jacob did, because he dug it deep. You're not going to find the source. But Jesus clarifies verses 13 and 14. Everyone who drinks this water will be thirsty again. Whoever drinks the water that I will give them will never thirst. Indeed, the water I give them will become in them a spring of water welling up to eternal life. And all of a sudden it's clear. He's not talking about physical water. He's not talking about physical thirst at all. And he's offering something that she is even more desperate for. He's not just pointing to a temporary need. He's not just pointing to a surface issue. Here's what he's done. He's moved out. He's leaned in, and now he begins to point up so that she can see that the source she's desperate for is so far beyond the thirst that she thought she came with. And yet she still doesn't get it, but you can tell that she wants to. More than anything else in the world, she wants to get it. Look at verse 15, how she responds. The woman says to him, "Sir, give me this water so that I won't get thirsty." But then it pops into her mind. Men have offered to quench her thirst before. Men have offered to solve her problem before. Men have offered to make things better before, and she's learned, if she's learned anything, not to trust men. So she says, give me this water so I won't get thirsty and have to keep coming here for water. Jesus does something unthinkable. Something that when you look at it at first glance seems so completely insensitive that you almost can't even believe that it happens to him. This woman who in this moment is wounded, in this moment is finally beginning to hope, is finally beginning to see maybe this could be different. Looks at her in the eye, and look at what it is that he says, verse 16 through 18. He told her, go call your husband and come back. And if you're watching this picture unfold in your head, you can see her eyes immediately go to the ground, because he's brought up the thing that she came to the well hoping to avoid. He's put his finger on the thing that she has hoped to not think of this whole day. And she says, as she looks down, I have no husband. Jesus says to her, you're right when you say you have no husband. The fact is, you've had 5 husbands, and the man you now have is not your husband. What you've just said is quite true. How could he? This thing that she's been trying to avoid, all of a sudden there at the well with the person who can give hope, and all of a sudden her soul is ripped apart by this man who points to the place where her greatest shame lies and her public disgrace comes from. How could he? But do you see what he did? Do you see what he's pointed to as he points up? See, this is sometimes why some of you get really uncomfortable with church people who love you. He took her right to the source of her thirst. And he says to this woman, as he looks her in the eye, life has left you thirsty, hasn't it? Jesus goes right to her heart. And he says to this woman, you are never going to quench your thirst by chugging more of the exact same thing that made you thirsty. And some of us need to hear his message this morning, don't we? Because life has left us thirsty. And maybe it's a dating relationship that you've been in for some time. And all of a sudden you keep pursuing more and more physical boundaries because you're thirstier than you were when you started. And the things that you'd done at the beginning no longer quench the thirst that you had. And so you push in to physical boundaries trying to quench your thirst with the things that made you thirsty to begin with. It's the husband that says, I'm just going to pursue one more deal and then I'll be quenched. One more promotion, one more paycheck, one more raise, and then it'll be okay, and we won't be thirsty anymore. It's the wife who programs all of her day because she thinks that somehow busyness is going to quench her thirst for happiness, and we add more and more, and we stand there and find ourselves thirsty, and Jesus looks at this woman and he says to her, life has made you thirsty, hasn't it? As he points this woman to the source. And all of a sudden, she states the obvious. Look at verse 19. Sir, the woman said, I can see you're a prophet. Which is the most obvious statement she could have made, right? But she's looking for a way to get out of this conversation, just like a whole lot of you have looked for ways to get out of conversations when people have leaned into the source of your thirst. She says, okay, you're a prophet. Here's how we can distract you. Here's how we can deflect you. Here's how we can move to something different. I'll ask you a theological question. And she asks him a question and says, if you're a prophet, maybe you could tell me, some people think we should worship here, and some people think we should worship here, and some people think we should keep this rule, and some people think we should keep this rule. Which one is it? And Jesus goes with her in that place, but he keeps pointing up, and he says to her, you can read his answer later on, but he says essentially to her, you know what? Horizontal religion should always be fueled by a vertical relationship. God seeks people who find their thirsts met in him, inside and out. He's not just looking for people that go to a certain church or keep a specific rule or don't do certain things. So back to that drink thing. So she throws out a trump card to kill the whole conversation. See what she says, verse 25? The woman says, I know that the Messiah, called Christ, is coming. When he comes, he'll explain everything to us. Nice to meet you. Bye. And you can imagine her beginning to pick up her water jug and gathering up her rope and walking away as she states this final thing. And yet Jesus' voice, I just have to imagine, gets quiet. And he leans in again as he points up and he says to the woman in response, I, the one speaking to you, am he. And their eyes locked in that moment. And she believed that he was telling the truth. And for her in this moment, everything changed. And she realized she didn't have to be thirsty anymore. We know because of what she does as she goes on. Look at verses 28 through 29. It says, then leaving her water jar, which is terribly symbolic, right? She's not even thinking about her physical thirst anymore. The woman went back into the town and she said to the people, come, see a man who told me everything I ever did. Could this be the Messiah? And you don't have the soundtrack to this passage, but you have to imagine that this is where the laugh track came in, right? As the people looked back at her and said, woman, you live in a small town. You've got a public history. You don't need a prophet. Everybody knows everything you've ever done. But there's something different about this interaction. And the scripture doesn't totally record it, but we know because of their response later. And maybe it's that she finally made eye contact with these people as the guilt and the shame went away. Maybe she walked with purpose, and for the first time she smiled as she said, there's somebody who knows everything I've ever done. And the justification for it went away. The hiding went away. Because in this interaction, in this moment, Jesus has uncovered the masterpiece. And all of these people in the village saw it. You know why we know that they saw it? Look on in the passage. Verses 38 to 39. Or verse 39. Look at just verse 39. Many of the Samaritans from that town believed in him. Why? Because of the woman's testimony. He told me everything I ever did. Maybe today you see yourself in this woman's story. And you showed up on a day when it's wet outside and you're thirsty. And you've gone from relationship to relationship and job to job and opportunity to opportunity and person to person, trying to find a way to quench your thirst. What Jesus wants you to hear this morning is that he wants to offer you the source. He wants to offer you hope that you don't ever have to be thirsty again. He wants you to see him and the living water that he can offer to you. And the good news for you today, even if you're messy, is that Jesus hasn't lost sight of the masterpiece. And that being cleaned up isn't a prerequisite to him seeing value in you. And if you've never had a chance to connect with Christ, or you've never taken the chance to connect with living water, and you find yourself thirsty this morning, I want to give you the chance to find living water today. Scripture tells us that Jesus went out. He left the comfort of heaven, and he came down and he humbled himself to the point of a cross where he took our mess on him. And he wants to offer us as a gift, clean. A slate that's wiped clean. He wants to give us hope. He wants to give you the source so that you can begin to hope again wherever you've been, whatever you've done, whatever you've seen. And he offers it to you simply as a gift to receive. And if you have never received that gift, what Jesus wants you to hear this morning is you are not too far gone. You have not done too much. It is not too late for you. And this morning, he wants to offer you the gift of everlasting life right where you sit. And you can do that in the privacy of your heart, telling him something like this: God, I'm a mess. But this morning I want to be clean. And I'm accepting the gift of hope. And if that's you this morning, I'd like to invite you to let us know that. There's a place on that connection card where you can let us know that you're connecting with Christ for the first time. You can take that to the Welcome Center after this service, or there are connection centers as you leave this place. We'd love to be able to celebrate you and to be able to help you have some resources, to give you some resources that can help you take that next step, to allow you the chance to go with at least one other person public in what it is that Jesus has done. Because see, here's the thing with this woman's story. If she hadn't had the courage to go back and to go public with the fact that she was thirsty and now allowing Jesus to quench her thirst, there was a whole village of people who would have never known who was standing right outside their city. And if you're connecting with Christ for the very first time this morning, we'd love to celebrate with you. Please don't miss this opportunity. But if you're a Christ follower, it may be that you've gotten messy. And you need to return to a connection with Christ that you had a long, long time ago. And you put yourself in the attic and find yourself messy. We'd love to know about that. We'd love to celebrate with you as well. But I want you to look back at the title of this message and the person to whom Jesus met at the well that day. What would it look like for you this week to move out of the comfort zone, out of the prejudice, out of the stereotype, out of the filth, out of the fear, out of the worrying? What would it look like for you to move out this week and to lean in to somebody that perhaps everybody else has leaned away from, and to point up to the source of living water? See, a lot of times we go into those conversations terrified that they're going to ask us a question that we don't know the right answer to, or that somehow we'll mess it up. Here's the truth. You don't have to know the answers to all of the questions. You just have to know where to find living water. And it's found in the man standing at a well who moved out and leaned in and pointed up for you. I hope we will always be a church full of people who seek to restore just like the Master. When the people that we see in the mirror, the people that we meet in life, find themselves a masterpiece covered by a mess.